Coming up on New Day at Arirang. North Korea on Thursday fired an intercontinental ballistic missile toward the EC, the first fully capability launch of an ICBM in more than 4 years. In response to North Korea's provocation, the South Korean military fired missiles from ground, sea, and air toward the EC. U.S. President Joe Biden says Russia should be kicked out of the Group of 20 nations in response for its invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, almost three-quarters of the UN General Assembly on Thursday demanded aid access and civilian protection in Ukraine, while criticizing Russia for creating a dire humanitarian situation. South Korea is expected to see over 300,000 COVID-19 cases on Friday, showing signs of a let-up. However, health authorities fear the daily death toll may continue to rise after the country reported a record-high number of deaths on Thursday.
Hello and welcome to this Friday edition of New Day at Arirang. I'm Kim Mo-gyan. Thank you for joining us.
And I'm Lee Sung-jae. It's 8 a.m. in Seoul, Korea on March 25th. Over the next hour or so, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the rest of the world. Now, our top story this morning, North Korea on Thursday launched a type of missile the regime hasn't tested at full range or capability since November 2017.
Seoul responded with live fire drills to display its ability to precisely strike the regime's missile launch points. Bae Eun-ji has our top story.
North Korea on Thursday fired an intercontinental ballistic missile toward the EC. Although it was launched at a steep angle, it is the first full capability launch of an ICBM in more than 4 years. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said the missile fired at around 2:30 p.m. from the Sunan airfield in Pyongyang traveled around 1,080 kilometers at an altitude of 6,200 kilometers. According to Japan's Coast Guard, it landed inside Japan's exclusive economic zone, 170 kilometers west of Aomori Prefecture, in the north of the country. Speaking to reporters on Thursday, a South Korean military official said the missile flew for more than an hour. In response to North Korea's provocation, the South Korean military fired missiles from ground, sea, and air toward the EC at 4:25 p.m., around 2 hours after the North launched its missile. It involved one surface-to-surface missile and one Army Tactical Missile System missile. The military also shot a Haesong-2 ship-to-ground missile and two JDAM, Joint Direct Attack Munition air-to-surface missiles.
We confirmed that we have the capability to precisely target the location of the launch as well as its command and support facilities whenever the North fires missiles.
The chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Won Int'l, held a virtual meeting with Commander of U.S. Forces Korea, General Paul Camara, where they reaffirmed to maintain strong defense posture. Also, shortly after today's launch, the Blue House convened an emergency National Security Council meeting where President Moon Jae-in strongly condemned the launch, saying that it's a clear violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Regarding the country's defense posture, he also ordered officials to closely cooperate with those working with President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol. Moon also called for an immediate halt in acts that raise tensions and urged the regime to return to talks. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
And a day after the launch, North Korea has confirmed that its recent launch was a test of its new Hwasong-17 intercontinental ballistic missile. The North state-run media Korean Central News Agency says its leader Kim Jong-un guided the launch Thursday. It quoted Kim as saying that Pyongyang will continue to focus on intensifying its defense capabilities to secure its dignity and autonomy. Kim also said the regime will prepare for its long-term fight against Washington. The regime said that the missile flew more than 1,000 kilometers for over 4,000 seconds before successfully landing on its expected target in the EC. Hwasong-17 is dubbed a monster missile for its size and was first revealed by the regime in a military parade in 2020.
Now, the North's missile test prompted an international outcry, with the White House calling it a, quote, brazen violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Global leaders also agreed to hold the regime accountable for its latest launch. For this, Kim Yo-sun reports.
Washington has strongly condemned North Korea's latest ICBM test, describing it as a violation of multiple UNSC resolutions. In a statement Thursday, the White House said the regime's latest move demonstrates that it continues to prioritize its weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile programs over the well-being of its people. President Joe Biden agreed with his Japanese counterpart Thursday to hold the North accountable for the latest launch after speaking briefly on the sidelines of the Group of Seven summit meetings in Brussels. The two also affirmed the need to resolve the escalating tensions on the Korean peninsula through diplomacy. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida also met with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson on the same day, agreeing to further intensify bilateral partnership, particularly in defense. The two also strongly condemned the North for its latest missile launch. Against this backdrop, the commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command says that the U.S. needs to deploy its next-generation missile defense systems on time or even earlier to keep pace with Pyongyang's growing missile capabilities. Addressing the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee on Thursday, General Glenn Van Herk, who is also the commander of U.S. Northern Command, expressed concerns about the speed of the regime's missile development. Saying that the U.S. currently has 44 ground-based interceptors deployed, he added 20 next-generation interceptors are set to be delivered by 2028. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the top diplomats of Seoul and Washington strongly condemned North Korea's ICBM launch, calling for additional measures by the UN Security Council. It remains to be seen whether Russia and China would support imposing additional sanctions on Pyongyang amid tensions with the United States. For this, Yoon Jung-min reports.
Seoul's Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong and his U.S. counterpart Antony Blinken agreed there needs to be stern responses, including additional measures by the UN Security Council. They spoke on the phone on Thursday and strongly condemned North Korea's ICBM test, saying it's a clear violation of UNSC resolutions and the regime has broken its moratorium. They also agreed to bolster the allies' close coordination while maintaining a strong joint defense posture. The same was discussed between the two countries' defense chiefs as well. On the same day, Seoul's chief nuclear envoy Do Gyu-duk and his U.S. counterpart Sung Kim also spoke on the phone and strongly condemned the recent ICBM test. They called the launch a serious threat not just to the Korean peninsula, but to the entire international community. Do and Kim urged the North to stop raising tensions immediately. Separately, Do also spoke with his Japanese counterpart Takehiro Funakoshi, and they too condemned the missile test. 6 countries, including the U.S., have reportedly requested an open briefing at the UN Security Council on Friday. Still, it remains to be seen whether it can garner support from Russia and China. Currently, the UNSC restricts the sale or transfer of all refined petroleum products to North Korea, with the allowed maximum aggregate being up to 500,000 barrels a year and limits crude oil supply to 4 million barrels. It could further tighten those restrictions following the ICBM test, but that would require at least 9 votes out of the 15 UNSC members. Also, there shouldn't be a veto by any of the 5 permanent members, which include Russia and China. It remains to be seen because there have been tensions between the U.S. and the West versus Russia and China over several geopolitical issues, including the war in Ukraine. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
And now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. course, on Thursday, North Korea fired an intercontinental ballistic missile towards the East Sea, its 12th show of force this year and its first ICBM launch since 2017.
Now, this confirms that North Korea has now fully lifted its self-imposed moratorium on nuclear and long-range missile testing. But what could it mean for South Korea and the incoming Yoon administration? To get an expert's insight on the latest missile launch, we're joined by Mason Rishi, Associate Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, the latest ICBM is known to be the biggest yet, and it's different from the Hwasong-15 launched in 2017. So what do we know so far about the North's latest ICBM launch?
So far, we think it's the largest liquid propellant missile that's ever been launched from a road mobile launcher, from a transport erector launcher, and that this time it was fired from around the Sunan airport. The fact that it was fired from the transporter erector launcher is also relatively new. That might well indicate that they have enough of these launchers to feel comfortable using them. We know that the first stage engine had a 160-ton force and likely uses what they call the March 18 Revolution engine, which is a variant of the RD-250 engines that are clustered together. They tested this Hwasong-17 on a highly lofted trajectory with about 1,000-kilometer range and 6,250-kilometer altitude, roughly over a 70-minute flight time. If you put all of those factors together, this missile can likely range all of the U.S. And indeed a pretty significant part of the world with multiple warheads, as the payload capacity is significant. Or with penetration aids to defeat U.S. missile defense assets.
So it seems like, North Korea, there's always some kind of reason behind their actions. But this time around, Professor, what message are they trying to convey with the latest ICBM launch? And at the same time, how do you see the current Moon administration deal with this launch and, of course, North Korea moving forward with, let's face it, just a little over a month left in their term?
Yeah, so, I don't necessarily think in the first place that what the Kim regime is doing here is per se sending a message. I think really what we're seeing is Kim is advancing his nuclear weapons program for technical reasons, for domestic political reasons, for deterrence purposes, perhaps for offensive or coercive leverage over South Korea and over the United States. And he's making progress on a list of capabilities, that have now been mentioned, by the analyst community following the Eighth Party Congress. These include this Hwasong-17 ICBM. This includes making progress, we think, on submarine-launched ballistic missiles, on hypersonic missiles with maneuverable payload vehicles, and other systems as well. If we want to see a message in this, I think the clearest message is North Korea is not going to denuclearize, and it's using global distraction from the Ukraine-Russia war as a window of opportunity to make some progress on these systems without feeling like it's running a particularly high risk of concerted international pushback, notably from China and Russia. I think the Moon administration is going to respond if there are any more of these tests, which is perhaps likely, similarly to today, by showing off its own capabilities to strike North Korea and to impose what it calls punishment or costs on it. Of course, the Moon administration will rely on working with the U.S. In the context of the U.S.-ROC alliance, and of course they'll make vocal condemnations both domestically and internationally.
Now, Professor, many say it's highly likely that the North will continue with even more provocations moving forward through the incoming Yoon administration. So how do you see President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol dealing with North Korea issues?
Well, The Yoon administration and his advisors have already telegraphed that they're going to take a firm stance on North Korea, probably a tougher and firmer stance even than the Moon administration. In the first place, Yoon and his team have already indicated that they're going to really solidify and bolster and shore up even more the U.S. ROC alliance. Presumably, that's going to include restarting the full spectrum of joint military exercises with the U.S. ROC combined forces. Obviously, the Yoon administration probably would take, in a similar situation, some measures like we saw the Moon administration take in terms of firing its own missile assets in response to these kinds of tests. Of course, we'll expect a very vocal condemnation, perhaps increased sanctions and sanctions enforcement from the South Korean side. And presumably, in parallel to that, we would see the Yoon administration reach out diplomatically to the international community, and perhaps even also to, for instance, China, to try to see if they can get North Korea to be reined in a little bit.
Let's kind of talk about the other party involved. The United States, let's face it, they've been dealing with the ongoing crisis over in Ukraine. So, North Korea-related issues certainly hasn't been at the top of their agenda. But with this latest missile launch, how does Washington going to respond to this? And, where does now Biden stand on the North Korea-related issue on his agenda?
This probably moves it up a little bit. It's true the Biden administration, has not been extremely proactive in terms of placing North Korea high on the list of priorities. But of course, the State Department, the Pentagon, the White House, in particular, the Security Council, they do have, plenty of staff, plenty of senior officials who are keeping an eye on the Korean Peninsula. And they can, as we say, walk and chew gum at the same time, or at least they indicate that they can. So I think that this will probably refocus a little bit of attention on the Korean Peninsula. It's nothing like we would have expected a few years ago. In response, that's largely because of the Russia-Ukraine situation taking up so much of the oxygen and so much of the attention. I think that probably we'll see, in fact, we've already seen a new announcement of sanctions out of Washington. They will bring this in front of the UN Security Council as well, although I think many people expect reasonably that there won't be a unity on the Security Council on ramping up international sanctions. The United States will work with its allies, including in Europe, I think, to sanction additional entities and people. And I think the most likely response on the military side is going to be the U.S. Stationing strategic assets in and around the Korean Peninsula as a way of bolstering deterrence. And then I think we can expect the U.S. and the incoming Yoon administration in the Republic of Korea to work together to improve military readiness in general in both conventional and extended nuclear deterrence.
I'm afraid that's still the time that we have for now. But Professor, thank you as always for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
World leaders came together Thursday for back-to-back meetings of the G7, NATO, and the EU. Biden, president all three of them, decided to bolster humanitarian aid to Ukraine and extend sanctions against Ukraine. He also said that America would react if Russia used chemical weapons. Kim Yan-sing with the latest.
Western leaders came together in Brussels on Thursday to discuss the urgent humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. The G7, NATO, and the EU met back-to-back. U.S. President Joe Biden, also present in Brussels, met with other leaders and decided to boost aid to Ukraine while toughening sanctions against Russia.
First was to support Ukraine with military and humanitarian assistance. Second was to impose the most significant sanctions, economic sanction regime ever, in order to cripple Putin's economy and punish him for his actions.
Billions of dollars in humanitarian aid and military equipment are on their way. The U.S. will also accept 100,000 refugees from Ukraine. Biden also said that if Russia uses chemical warfare, the U.S. will not sit idly by to watch.
We would respond. We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use.
The G7 has also warned Russia against the use of biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons in a joint statement. World leaders also came to other collective agreements that they must stand united for peace and to support Ukraine.
This morning's NATO summit allowed us to decide on several elements. First, there's unanimity on continuing to reinforce support for Ukraine to provide them with defensive arms and equipment that it needs.
The UN General Assembly also met to discuss the crisis. Almost 3/4 of the international body, 140 countries, voted to demand aid access and civilian protection in Ukraine while blaming Russia for the humanitarian crisis. The resolution was adopted Thursday with 5 votes against, including Russia, Syria, and North Korea, and 38 votes abstained, including China. Meanwhile, humanitarian atrocities are being reported daily out of Ukraine. On Thursday, Ukraine accused Moscow of forcibly taking hundreds of thousands of civilians out of Ukraine and into Russia, sometimes using them as hostages. UNICEF also reports that more than half of Ukraine's children, estimated at around 4.3 million, have been driven out of their homes due to the war. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Now, moving on to the COVID-19 situation here in Korea, though we've seen a drop in the number of daily COVID-19 infections, deaths related to the virus have climbed up.
Just on Thursday, Korea logged the highest number of daily deaths, but authorities are stressing that we have a low fatality rate. For more, we turn to Yoon, who joins us live in the studio. Good morning, Yoon.
Good morning.
So how many cases are we expecting for today?
Well, Mugan, we're expecting to see the daily caseload hover in the 300,000 because as of 9 p.m. on Thursday, we have recorded 328,909 COVID-19 infections. Now, this was down by more than 51,000 from the same time the previous day. And compared to a week ago, figures have crawled down by 64,000. And for 2 straight days, we've been seeing caseloads drop, but authorities aren't being too hasty as to whether we've actually passed through the peak of the Omicron surge and have entered a phase where infections will drop.
You know, it's one of those good news, bad news thing. The good news is we are seeing the infection numbers dip down, but the bad news is we are seeing a very high number of fatality. Now, you know, even Thursday we saw record high numbers. Now, the interesting thing is some of the authorities are saying that we are seeing a low fatality rate, but at the same time, some of the experts kind of beg to differ. Can you tell us about this?
Sure. Just yesterday, as you mentioned, we saw the highest number of deaths from COVID at 470, bringing the total death toll of COVID to 13,902. And this is only from infections added 2 or 3 weeks ago when daily tallies hovered in the 200,000s. Recently, we've been seeing numbers stay in the 300,000s or 400,000s. And last week, we had the highest addition of over 620,000. And this means that Korea may see double the amount of deaths as now, bringing tallies to more than 1,000 deaths a day in the coming weeks. And a few experts say that we may actually have 2 or 3 times more deaths than the total tally announced by the government, given that there are some deaths the government doesn't know of. And this includes those who died of complications after completely recovering from COVID-19, or those who were infected but didn't know about it, or those who couldn't get proper treatment because they weren't at any hospital beds. There weren't any hospital beds available for them. But the government is saying that South Korea has a low fatality rate at 0.13%. Authorities added that the official death count includes those who have underlying conditions and didn't die from symptoms of COVID, but their previous health conditions. And both health authorities and experts say those at high risk definitely needs to be treated effectively.
So, Yoon, how can high-risk groups be treated effectively? Any propositions?
Well, experts have called for more management and caution at nursing homes, which take up a third of all deaths. To that, authorities said they will prescribe more antiviral pills and put more effort into treating COVID-19 patients with underlying conditions. Authorities believe that this particular group is at high risk, and many need more monitoring and management to treat their initial illness rather than just COVID. And that's why officials have been discussing whether to stop giving out rapid antigen tests at all screening clinics. This means that only people at high risk will be tested by medical staff, and they will be tested using PCR tests. Everybody else will have to use self-test kits, and authorities are considering to provide them at the screening clinics. So far, most districts have agreed to this decision in hopes that medical staff out at screening clinics can instead focus on treating patients. If discussions go as planned, this change could come in from April 4th. This is also when the country expects to kick off new social distancing measures.
All right, so let's move on to the vaccination front, because starting yesterday on Thursday, we did see the reservations for Pfizer shots for children aged 5 to 11. But the big question is, are parents on board with this?
Well, the majority of parents don't want their children vaccinated, at least not at this time. The Central Disease Control Headquarters conducted a survey on some 359,000 elementary school parents to ask whether they were willing to vaccinate their child. 6 out of 10 said no. Most parents said they wanted to check the waters and wait for more related studies and cases of child vaccinations, as most are concerned about side effects. And experts said this type of information should be transparently delivered. Now, this comes as vaccinations for this age group are set to kick off on March 31st.
All right, Yoon, thank you so much for your report. We appreciate it, and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
The Transition Committee will push ahead with the president-elect's judicial reform and remove the Justice Minister's authority to direct investigations to help the prosecution maintain political neutrality.
That's right. The prosecution itself widely supports the plan, but the current Justice Ministry does not. Lee Kyung-in has the latest.
President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's Transition Committee is hearing policy briefings from major ministries. But on Thursday, the hearing from the Justice Ministry was postponed at the last minute, as Justice Minister Park Bum-gye just the day before objected to Yoon's campaign promises for judicial reform.
It is rude and incomprehensible that an outgoing minister opposes the pledges of a president-elect chosen by the people.
Justice Minister Park had objected to Yoon's plans to remove the Justice Minister's authority to direct investigations and empower the prosecution to draw up its own budget instead of the Justice Ministry. Park cited the need of transparency, but the committee emphasized neutrality.
The reform plan reflects the president-elect's will to restore public trust in the prosecution and strengthen the independence and political neutrality of the prosecution.
Later in the afternoon, the committee announced it has had a separate policy briefing from the Supreme Prosecutor's Office, which largely agreed with Yoon's plan. To that, the committee said it will push ahead with the reform plan through a direct order by the new Justice Minister to come. Meanwhile, the committee has appointed Professor Shim Kyo-eun to head its task force on real estate. Shim has been largely critical of the current government's public sector-driven housing policies.
The team will lay out the agenda related on the urgent task of stabilizing the housing market and their plan to prevent any side effects in the market.
Members of the planning committee have also been finalized. In the body unique to Yoon's transition team, they'll be making sure his election pledges are carried out. 1/3 of the members are young adults, an age group Yoon targeted during his campaign. Lee Kyung-in, Arirang News.
South Korea's low birth rate led the country's population to its first ever decline. In 2021, the total fertility rate fell to a new low for the 5th straight year. Now, an annual report on Korean society also showed that more people felt lonely during the pandemic. Kim Sung-min has the full story.
South Korea, for the first time, saw its total population actually decline last year. This is according to an annual report on society from Statistics Korea.
The report for 2021 released on Thursday shows that South Korea's population was 51.75 million. This is a fall of 90,000 from the peak a year before. And because of the country's low birth rate, the population is expected to keep shrinking for the foreseeable future, falling as low as 50 million by 2040. The total fertility rate dropped to a new record low for a fifth straight year at 0.81 births per woman. That figure is the lowest in the OECD, well below the average of 1.61 in 2019. This came as the number of marriages also dropped to an all-time low of 193,000 last year. And with more people choosing to live alone or not have babies, family size in South Korea shrunk to an average of just 2.3 members. That was down almost 0.8 members from a decade ago. Adding to that, the pandemic has only weakened social connection. Only 2 in 10 people said they had someone who they can talk to when feeling depressed, down from 6 in 10 people in 2019. And the depression was apparently felt more by people who are less well off. On a positive note, South Korea's job market continued to recover, with the employment rate rising to 60.5%, up 0.4 percentage points on year. Also, the number of crimes reported per 100,000 people dropped to just over 3,300, a decline of more than 14% from a decade ago. 김성민, Arirang News.
Welcome to Dialogue This Week. In this corner, we invite guests from in and out of Korea to talk about a wide variety of issues ranging from culture and sports to the latest trends around the world. 2 South Korean novelists have been longlisted for the 2022 International Booker Prize, one of the 3 most significant literary awards in the world. This is all the more significant for South Korea as it marks the first time that 2 Korean authors have made the prize longlist at the same time. Chung Bora's Cursed Bunny and Park Sang-young's Love in the Big City have been included in the 13 preliminary nominees for the British Prize, which was first established in 2005. The Booker Prize honors an author and its translator equally for a single work of fiction translated into English. Chung and Park have become the 3rd and 4th Koreans to be nominated for the prize after Han Gang in 2016 and 2018 and Hwang Seok-young in 2019. Another thing to note this year is that both of the nominated books were translated by one person. Translator Anton Ha has the honor of being longlisted for both Korean works. So for Dialogue this week, we invite Anton Ha, the translator of both Cursed Bunny and Love in the Big City, and Eugene Lee, who's also a translator and a former professor of literary translation, both via Skype. Welcome to you both to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Well, Anton, first, I want to congratulate you for the nominations.
Thank you so much.
So, as I've mentioned, the International Booker Prize is one of the 3 largest literary awards in the world. It's the first time that 2 South Korean authors have made the nomination list at the same time, and you translated both of these books. So, I must ask, how did you feel when you received news of the nominations?
Well, I received news of the nominations separately. I received news of Cursed Bunny first, and I remember looking at the email, and then I called my spouse, and then I cried. But then I received the second email, and then we hung up. And then the second email I received for Love in the Big City, like 10 to 15 minutes later. And then so I called my spouse again, and I said, I think I'm nominated for this book too. And the second time I didn't cry because I thought, at that point, I thought this is a prank. This is basically what happened to, I keep saying, to John Bansville, the Irish novelist, because someone did a prank call on him saying that he won the Nobel Prize. And he believed it, and he told all of his friends that he won the Nobel Prize, and it turned out it wasn't him, it was someone else that year, and it had been a prank call. So I thought, oh, maybe this is a John Bansville scenario.
Well, it wasn't. Well, I can't imagine how much happy you were. But now let's also invite Eugene into the conversation. So Eugene, just to get a little bit of background. So the work of translating is challenging, as not only does the translator need to understand the language, including its culture, but also the intention of the author. So generally, how are authors and translators kind of matched with each other?
Typically, that will be the job of a publisher. What a publisher tries to do is match the pitch between an author and the translator to create better harmony. So basically, you could say that it's the publisher's job.
All right. And, you know, the two books, Bora Jung's Cursed Bunny and Park Sang-young's Love in the Big City, are entirely kind of different genres. So what's the subject matter of both of these books of interest to you, Anton? And what are some of the challenges of covering such a vast range of genres?
Yeah, absolutely. In my case, the publisher did not choose me as the translator for either of these books. I chose to translate both of these books. I submitted them. I did all of the work, and basically, I brought them into translation. To the attention of publishers. And so these translations were very much translator created in every sense of the word. The subject matter of both these books definitely were of interest to me. I wanted to translate a gay romance. I wanted to translate women's literature. I wanted to translate genre literature. I wanted to translate a work of speculative literature specifically. And I don't find it a challenge to cover different genres, because I feel like as a reader, I read in different genres. And as long as I understand the works as they should be understood in different genres, then I have confidence in my abilities as a translator to bring that reading into English. And hopefully that is what I did. And that is what the Booker judges have determined that I did this time around.
So what about the challenges? What was the biggest challenge as you did your translating?
The challenge was getting funding for the books. The challenge was getting, submitting them, getting publishers interested in two authors that have never been translated, much less translated into English, which is probably the hardest language to get a translation published in, because there's so much English works, there's so much competition for translations to be translated into English. So getting people's attention, doing the marketing, like that was a big challenge. Translating itself is a very small part of my work, and it was frankly the easiest and most pleasant part of the process.
Well, despite the obstacles, you did a great job. Well, the, International Booker Prize became an annual award in 2016. Before, it was given every 2 years. So what was the scene of translating literary works like in 2016? Was it becoming more widespread for there to be more books available in English as potential nominees for the prize? Eugene.
Well, as you just heard, translating literary works requires courage and dedication. And an award like the International Booker Prize definitely generates momentum for more translations of literary works. And basically, you could say that it's become easier now than before 2016. It just makes more sense now, especially with this year's nominations.
Mm-hmm. So how is it a little bit more easier? Can you specify on that a little bit?
Because there's more interest generated. What Anton just described is really, as a translator, somebody who's done translation, I understand that really requires a lot of courage. I would assume that before 2016, it was much more difficult to do it. But because in 2016, the first International Booker Prize, it's actually the first year that it went international. I mean, it went annual. It's the first time that a Korean won it. So I think it has opened more doors.
Mm-hmm. Well, many of you might remember, but author Han Gang was the first South Korean to win what was then the Man Booker International Prize back in 2016. How do you feel her book, The Vegetarian, has paved the way for other translated Korean works, Anton?
I want to emphasize that the Booker Prize is given not to the author, but also to the translator, and so many people forget this fact. In 2016, it wasn't just Han Gang who won the Booker Prize, it was also Deborah Smith, the translator. Deborah Smith revolutionized Korean literature in translation with her translation of The Vegetarian. She enabled a kind of translation that was more focused on the reader and not reverentially translating every single little thing that the author had put on the page, creating what is basically a directly translated mess. And so, which professors, not professors like Eugene, hopefully, but many Korean professors tend to prefer direct translation, and they tend to award direct translation, and they tend to value direct and literal translations, really have very little literary value, and perhaps are more of interest to scholars than actual readers of English literature. So it really was Deborah Smith that we should give credit for censoring the reader once more in these literary translation discourses.
Well, so that actually became, the point where people kind of changed the way they see translations. But so more on this, Eugene, as you know, literary works are highly influenced by their cultural context. So whether the reader knows the cultural background generally does impact their understanding of the writing. And just as Anton kind of mentioned, when literary works from varying language get translated into English, do they get neutralized, or do translators work to keep as much cultural color as possible?
Well, any language translated into any language always carries the burden of becoming neutralized. So there's definitely always the pressure of that. But you have to think, why are we so worried, and what can we do about it? I would say that we, as readers, need to put more faith in translators, because usually it's the translators who have thought about neutralization the most. And I'm pretty sure that any good translator, any great translator like Anton Her, would have thought so much more about this issue of how to translate, how to avoid and appropriate cultural color than what I would feel in a passing moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about you, Anton? Like, for example, one of your book translations is, I want to die, but I want to eat tteokbokki. So even from just the title, what would you say gets lost in translation?
Are you kidding me? I want to die, but I want to eat tteokbokki. Like, everyone loves that title. Everyone in the Anglosphere loves that title. When we announced that title, like on Twitter, on Instagram, people went nuts over the title. They get the title. Nothing is lost in translation in the title of I want to die, but I want to eat tteokbokki. Okay, we're moving a whole bunch of literature from one language to another. So of course things are going to get lost. I mean, that's just inevitable. But of all the examples that we can come up with, I want to die, but I want to eat tteokbokki. Like, no, that is not a good example of lost in translation.
Well, maybe I forgot about the fact that tteokbokki became a lot more globalized lately. But, what's been dubbed K-culture has been gaining popularity over the past decade, and even more so in recent years. So one would assume, though, that the general audience for K-pop would be different from those for K-literature. So how does Korean literature fit into this scheme? Is it getting more attention these days? And why now, Eugene?
Well, basically, John Dryden, the famous British poet from the 1600s, once said that dancing is the poetry of the foot. What I would say is that K-pop fans, the general audience for K-pop, definitely are more inclined to accept K-culture than those in the same age group who are not aware of K-culture. The same goes for K-food, K-drama, and K-culture in general. So basically, you could say that right now is probably the best time for K literature to spread globally.
Well, that's something good to hear. Well, now back to Anton. Since I also work in Korea at an English broadcast station, I also need to, read Korean articles to put them into English, but usually not the other way around. So I'm curious, how is translating Korean writing into English different from English writing into Korean?
I mean, you probably deal with this, like you just said, like every single day. I think written English is very vernacular, whereas written Korean is not as much. However, written Korean is becoming more vernacular, especially literary Korean is becoming more vernacular by the day. And you have authors even authors from who are slightly older, like Kyung Suk Shin, or even Hwang Seok-young, writing in slightly more vernacular Korean than they used to. So a lot of it has to do with translating into a more vernacular language or a less vernacular language than it does have to do with, word choices and whatnot. Like the vibe of the written language is very different in both languages still. So I guess that would be the biggest difference.
All right. But before we let you go, Eugene, what do you think the next decade looks like for Korean literary works and their translations?
Well, a decade is a long time to say what would happen. Well, what I can say for sure is that Anton Her, yes, you, sir, you will play a pivotal role in the next coming decade in terms of translating Korean literary works. And it's because of you, because of translators like you, that Korean literature being introduced to a global audience has a much brighter future. So way to go, brother.
Wow, that was a very sweet and encouraging message. Well, I'm afraid we will have to wrap it up at this point. Well, thank you so much for making time for us, Eugene and Anton. We wish you the best of luck in making it to the upcoming shortlist. And I hope both of you have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
The South Korean national football team defeated Iran 2-0 in their final World Cup qualifying match at home on Thursday. Playing in front of a sellout crowd of some 64,000 at Seoul World Cup Stadium, Captain Son Heung-min scored in the dying moments of the first half before defender Kim Yong-gun added a second-half goal. Now, the win was their first over Iran since January 2011 and saw the home team overtake their Middle East rival for the top spot in Group A of the final Asian World Cup qualifying round. Meanwhile, Japan beating Australia 2-0 on Thursday means they've qualified for their 7th straight World Cup, finishing atop Group B. At the same time, Saudi Arabia having also qualified for football's biggest stage after drawing against China 1-1. Now, the Chinese media regulator allowed several Korean dramas to be shown on streaming platforms. Now, many are curious as to whether this is a sign of the end of Beijing's cultural freeze. Kim Bo-kyung turned to several experts for their insights on the matter.
Familiar dramas with Chinese titles. Beijing has unofficially banned Korean cultural content from being consumed in China since 2017 as part of its economic retaliation against Korea's introduction of the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System from the U.S. However, starting early this March, domestic broadcaster JTBC's drama Something in the Rain began to be streamed through one of the major Chinese over-the-top services, ITE, while TVN's Prison Playbook, Another Miss O, and Queen In-hyun's Men have re-entered the Chinese version of YouTube known as Bilibili. Though not the latest releases, these dramas are regaining popularity among Chinese viewers, getting millions of views. South Korean drama's unique storytelling has been pointed to as the element that caught the eyes of Chinese millennials and Gen Z.
Chinese content is usually historical or political. Compared to that, Korean content has quite a lot of freedom and variation, and its storylines are delicate and emotionally sensitive, which might be the reason behind its popularity.
Korean dramas being shown on Chinese streaming platforms is significant, as it means the drama was approved by the Chinese media regulator. Experts, however, say this is far from the end of the years-long cultural freeze.
Screenings of the latest content on public broadcasters and cable TV is still tough. And to say the ban has been lifted, publications, movies, and variety TV programs should be able to be released.
He adds that there might have been a political intention behind such action, China trying to use it as leverage before starting off a new relationship with the incoming government in South Korea.
China needs to redefine its diplomatic status with South Korea. By approving several dramas as a way of setting examples, China would have wanted to see how the new government reacts to it.
China's internal politics, too, could determine whether such favorable moves continue, with President Xi looking to strengthen his position at the Communist Party National Congress set for this year.
When it comes to propaganda, media is very important. Because Xi getting ready for his third term, restrictions on foreign content might be strengthened to spread patriotism.
But Korea's content industry is hoping China makes more moves to allow Korean cultural content. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Good morning. Last weekend, we saw a massive amount of snowfall in Gangwon-do province, and this weekend, there will be storm force conditions for Jeju and the south coast. Rain is forecast to start from late this afternoon in the south, spreading nationwide overnight. And it's going to rain more than 30 millimeters an hour on Jeju Island. And what's more, a strong wind advisory is to be issued in Jeju and along the coastal regions. Winds will be strong enough to uproot trees, so please take precautionary measures against the severe weather conditions. Well, morning temperatures are starting out at about 10 degrees Celsius over in Busan, Jeju, and Gwangju this morning. Highs will rise fast, 1 to 7 degrees higher than yesterday afternoon. Seoul, Daejeon, Gwangju will be topping out at 19 degrees Celsius. Conditions will be much improved by Sunday, but rain will bring a brief morning chill to the country early next week. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's all we have for now. We will be back for another episode of New Day at Arirang at 8 a.m. Korea time next Monday. I'm Kim Mo-kyun.
And I'm Lee Seung-jae. Have a great rest of the day, and thanks always for joining us. Take care.
Everyone knows I'm passionate. Know why? Look at how passionate Koreans are. And you know I'm fast. Don't blink. Koreans move fast too. I'm creative on the pitch. People say I'm smart. Just look how smart Korea is. I aim to be spectacular for the fans. Why am I so fun? Is it because Korea is so much fun? Visit Korea and find out for yourself. See you there. This is my career.